Today I will be making several videos on the topic of Stanford prison experiment, but first I have to make a disclaimer. I am personally acquainted with Phil Zimbardo. I met him multiple times at Western Psychological Association convention, had multiple conversations with him, was on a panel with him where we all talked about using storytelling to teach psychology. I own an autographed copy of The Lucifer Effect, and my husband has autographed matching t-shirt. In other words, there is this personal thing, and I also have heard him talk about Stanford prison experiment. I don't actually know how many times, critically and not. I have to also point out that every time he talks about it, he makes Christina Maslach, his now wife who stopped the prison experiment, to be the hero of the story. That's something to note. I teach about Stanford prison experiment when I teach social psychology to my intro students, but it is a critical teaching, and let's talk about it. Social psychologist Phil Zimbardo joined Stanford faculty in 1968, and in the summer of 1971, he conducted an experiment that changed his entire career and became perhaps one of the most talked about studies of all time. I'm calling it an experiment because methodologically it's pretty problematic. But let's first look at how participants were recruited. Participants for this study were selected through this newspaper ad. They were all college students in Stanford area at the time, but not actually Stanford students from other colleges and universities. Everybody was middle class, but clearly in need of that $15, which in today's money would be 90-something. Over 70 people applied and 20-something were selected, all of them white except one. All of these students were pre-screened for various psychological issues and traits, checked for any prior involvement with law enforcement, and for whether or not any of them knew each other. This is a consent form signed by the participants in the study. This is not the way that the informed consent would be signed today, because we allow participants to quit at any time in psychological research. However, these people signed onto this study knowing that they are in for 2 weeks and that they can't get out of it unless there is a compelling medical or otherwise important reasons. In other words, they were told that they can't quit. The participants were randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards. The prisoners found out about the assignment by being arrested by real cops in real police cars and then processed, fingerprinted, etc. The guards were told that they are going to ensure the order in this prison and that their role was to help the experimenters because the study was about the prisoner behavior. They were essentially Confederates. And so this problematic prison simulation began. The police officers that were helping Zimbardo arrest his future prisoners were curious whether the students wanted to be prisoners or guards. They thought everybody would want to be a guard. But Zimbardo said to them that, well, no, in fact, no one wanted to be a guard. They all preferred to take the prisoner role. And here's why. I'm curious to see how my TikTok poll turns out, but I can tell you that when I ask my classroom students about this, practically nobody wants to be a prisoner nowadays. They all want to be a guard. And that's before they learn about the Stanford prison experiment. We live in different times. It is interesting you should say that because Phil Zimbardo would agree. He sometimes refers to himself as a bleeding heart liberal. Before doing the Stanford prison experiment, he co-taught a summer class with Carlo Prescott, who was a former prisoner. And in the process, he learned a lot about prisons and prison life and became a very strong opponent of prison system in general. One of the purposes to do the Stanford prison experiment was to learn how prison environment can affect people and perhaps to show that it needs to be changed. This is from a well-known Ben Bloom article that criticizes Zimbardo's prison experiment as a lie. I'm not sure why Bloom thinks that's a bad thing, but this article basically blames Zimbardo for attempts at prison reform and for promoting the idea that prisons are really, really bad. Lord of the Flies is mentioned 9 times in the Lucifer Effect. So while it wasn't a direct influence on Stanford prison experiment, it certainly influenced Phil Zimbardo's interest in de-individuation, as evidenced by his earlier study. The simplistic explanation often given to this question by both textbooks and Zimbardo's critics is that he believed that the situations had power over people and he wanted to demonstrate that. However, it's a little bit more nuanced. I'm going to get out of the way in a sec and let you read the explanation by Greg Haney, one of Zimbardo's collaborators that Zimbardo puts in the Lucifer effect. What I find interesting is, in light of this explanation, we should be considering the fact that everybody in the study was pretty much white, middle-class American student to be a feature, not a bug of the study. The homogeneity was intentional and necessary. Now, can we generalize from that sample to everybody else? That's a whole another story. But there was a reason for the selection of these participants. It wasn't an accident or a mistake. Now, I already directly addressed this comment, but I want to make a video about this because this thought that these kids were all affluent Stanford students is actually a very common thought, and especially very prevalent in various TikTok videos criticizing the Stanford prison experiment. Let me show you something. In my previous video, I said these students were from Stanford area and not actually from Stanford University. I was incorrect. Apparently, a couple of them were, in fact, Stanford students, but most of them were not. They were from other schools. And to say that they were all affluent is a really big stretch. One of them lived in a car, and all of them needed that $15. Another interesting feature of that group of students is their political activism and orientation. But let's talk about the guards' instruction because it's a big point of contention in criticisms of Zimbardo's prison experiment. In this study, the guards were actually told that they're there to help the experiment. They were told that they're not really subjects, and there is some questions as to whether that was originally the intent of the researchers. However, here in this peer-reviewed publication of their study, they're talking about how they were interested in observing the behavior of the guards, and of course they did observe the behavior of the guards. This is about the guard orientation from the Lucifer effect. And these are the instructions the guards received verbatim from the transcript. And no, the research question told for the guards was not the actual research question, but this is where we start having problems. So what really happened in the Stanford prison experiment once the prisoners were arrested and the guards were instructed and the prison simulation began? That depends if you ask Phil Zimbardo, here rated in popular press and here in a peer-reviewed publication, or his critics. Here's the famous publication by Ben Bloom in press, and here's a well-known critique by Letixier in peer-reviewed publication. I have all of these and more in my bio under Stanford prison experiment resources. However, the consensus is that bad things were done to prisoners by guards. The disagreement is why did that happen and how bad really were these things? How much of this might have actually been acting, like some of the participants say now? We can't dismiss possibility of cognitive dissonance though now, and the possibility that they want to look different than they looked originally. We don't know. The reality of Stanford prison experiment is there are too many questions. Did you know that the infamous Stanford prison experiment was not really an experiment? An experiment in psychology would require that there be systematic manipulation and observation of some elements of a situation, and control over other elements. This didn't really happen in this study. While there was definitely manipulation and observation, none of that was truly systematic, and very little was controlled. There was no control group, there was no comparison. So even Zimbardo over the years started talking about this as a demonstration. The original peer-reviewed publication of the study mentions that it was experimental. But in the Lucifer effect published in 2007, Zimbardo himself refers to it as a demonstration. This, of course, predates the most recent and the most famous criticism of the study. However, it should be noted that even the critics are aware that there is still something to be learned here, even if it was pretty messed up. Do you know what puzzles me about the various criticisms of the Stanford prison experiment? It's how few people mention the dual roles that Phil Zimbardo played in the study. See, he was supposed to be the principal investigator. He was supposed to be outside of the prison, but in reality he puts himself on the inside of the prison as the superintendent. He himself is aware that that's a pretty big problem. He believes that the situation in his pretend prison started getting really bad very, very quickly and that he should have stopped the study right then, and instead he allowed it to continue because he wanted to preserve his prison. That is also why when Christina Maslach, his then girlfriend, who was invited to help with the study, pointed out to him how bad it was, he didn't at first want to believe her because he was too invested. That should never happen. Thank you for asking. The biggest issue is actually the harm that was done to the participants. That is what Zimbardo himself would be the first to point out, and that is the reason the study was stopped early. This understanding of harm is why the first publication in academic journal about this study by Zimbardo was in fact on the ethical problems. In addition to not stopping the study as soon as the problems appeared, Zimbardo also points out that the fact that they arrested the prisoners at home without warning them or their parents was also very problematic. That was not disclosed and they didn't expect that. But mainly, of course, it was a very real suffering that the study created. The study was approved by the Human Subjects Committee at Stanford, but the informed consent was not fully informed because nobody knew what was really going to happen. They kind of went on the fly a little bit there, and they said there wasn't going to be deception, but the guards were deceived about their roles. The Stanford prison experiment is often brought up in the context of replication crisis in psychology as a study that doesn't replicate. Well, the reason that it doesn't replicate is that it can't be replicated exactly or even closely for ethical reasons. For example, the most famous attempt at replication was done as sponsored by BBC. Now, the authors propose various reasons for why they did not achieve the same results as Zimbardo, because of course they had a competing hypothesis. And Zimbardo's hypothesis may not actually have been supported by his study either, but this one is not a replication of the Zimbardo study because it was done on TV, it had very many very different parameters, it had a different hypothesis. It really isn't what anybody would consider a replication. The link to this and to Zimbardo's reply is in my bio. And of course, when we saw Strive a replication, it was not a replication at all, it was completely different.